That was good.
But actually, we are here in Helsinki having our best time just now because we're going to get a super lecture. Actually, we have no a clue if it's going to be a super lecture, but we will have at least the super lecturer. So I am so thrilled to have Steve Brown here. I think Steve Brown's book was the book that was I had, of course, read Billinghurst's books and kind of always being very interested in the raw food, but like Steve Brown's book, The Ancestral Diet, made so much sense. And it was so good, so small, so thin that even I could read it. And it just made and I made everybody I knew read it. So you made a super impact in my life. And then, so I think that, like Barbara said, that Steve and Susan, they're both working still with the animal diet formulator, which also Barbara works with. And I'm going just to give over to both of you now, and just please stay close to the computer or mic when you're talking so that we can get all the information. And thank you for doing this and being at our seminar.
Well, thank you for inviting us. We're going to have a lot of fun with this presentation. So hang on.
Yes, thank you very much for inviting us. We're delighted to be here. And we're going to talk today about how to choose the nutritionally best meat-based foods for your dog.
As you know, I'm Steve Brown. I'm one of the original founders of the raw diet industry in the United States. I produced my first AVCO compliant, NRC compliant, nationally distributed food in 1997. I'm the author, as Anna said, of Unlocking the Canine Ancestral Diet. I'm a raw food formulator, and I'm very, very detailed in analyzing my data and the analysis. I'm not a veterinarian and I'm not a nutritionist. My job is to provide nutrient data and analysis for veterinarians and nutritionists.
And I'm Susan Recker, and I am a veterinarian, and I worked in private clinical practice for 25 years. So I have seen firsthand the power of nutrition and what amazing things can happen for animal health when they're eating an optimal diet. And I've also seen the negative consequences that can occur when they're not being adequately nourished by their food. I've also spent several years educating veterinary technician students. And I have had the pleasure of learning a lot about formulating diets from Steve, which dovetails nicely with my personal interest in food. I'm a self-professed foodie for myself. I like to prepare food. I like to eat food, but I'm also kind of a foodie for my canine and feline patients. I really enjoy creating diets that will meet all of their needs and that they will enjoy eating. So hopefully we can.
Recently, you created over 1,000 recipes.
I would say about there. Yeah.
Yeah. It's a lot of work. So today what we're going to talk about, we have two parts to this presentation. The first part is what are fresh meat-based diets? That's our focus. Then we'll look at 3 different approaches to feeding them. And then we'll look quickly at how we compare foods and recipes. And then we'll get to the part 2, the one I'm most excited to talk about. And that's the macro dangers of the prey model approach using not prey model ingredients and influencers who prefer ignorance to knowledge. Let me be very clear. A well-made prey model diet is about the best you could feed a dog. A poorly formulated diet influenced by people who do not know much may be about the worst way you could feed dogs. And then we're going to talk about the conclusions, which is very basic. Learn. Go ahead.
So we have two thesis statements today that will dictate and kind of be the overarching theme of what we're talking about today. The first is that we believe that the best foods and best recipes meet the minimum recommended amounts for different nutrients established by the NRC, and they follow the ancestral or true prey models. The second is that recipe formulators need to know the amounts of nutrients that are in the food that they've created, the recipe that they've formulated, and they should be able to produce that information upon request. So when a dog owner says, well, how much manganese is in my recipe? The recipe formulator needs to be able to produce that information.
Or even how much protein's in my recipe, because some of these don't show. Some of the recipe influencers don't know how much protein or fats in their recipes.
And we're going to talk quite a bit about that
in
just a few moments.
So what is a fresh meat based diet? The intent is to mimic the ancestral diet. I think most of us, that's what we're trying to do. Most of the calories come from meat. It's high protein, high fat, low carbohydrate, and minimally processed. I prefer raw diets. Some people like dehydrated, freeze-dried, or gently cooked. Those are not raw. Raw means not cooked, not freeze-dried, not processed. But freeze-dried and dehydrated can be really, really good diets.
Yeah, and they fall into that fresh meat-based diet category, even when they're not raw. So we believe that the best diets share these 6 characteristics that you see on our screen here. The first is that they are as fresh as possible, using minimally processed meat as the base for the diet. The second is that the recipe provides all or almost all of the nutrients from whole foods. When that's not possible, then we use our third guideline, using targeted nutrient fortification to meet the NRC recommended minimum allowances for specific activity levels and life stages. And we do that without exceeding maximums. So we're very intentional about any supplements that we may add to the diet when we can't meet needs with whole foods. A fourth guideline is that the diet should have more than 80% of its calories coming from protein and fat as opposed to carbohydrates. That's the piece of this that we're going to talk most about today. A fifth guideline is that the diet needs to contain sources of fiber, and that can be fiber from fur and hair, but we also need polyphenols and antioxidants from plant matter. And we'll talk about how the ancestral dog did consume plant matter and that it's an integral part of their diet and confers a lot of health benefits. And finally, the last characteristic of the best diets is that they retain a natural balance of nutrients, meaning that we don't have one nutrient or a couple of nutrients that are out of proportion in relative to the other nutrients in the diet. We want a total balance.
And we find that some of the highly supplemented foods, kibble or fresh meat-based diets, will not have a natural balance. They may be AVCO, NRC complete and balanced, but they don't have a natural balance of nutrients. One of our guidelines is that a good fresh meat-based diet provides 80% of the calories from protein and fat, but not 90% of the calories from fat, which some of the, let's say, advice from influencers that lack knowledge have advised. So we're looking at following the ancestral diet, which is really the calories come from about 45 to 50% from protein, 45 to 50% from fat. Even going up to 60% of the calories from fat, keep it in range with the ancestral diet.
Yes, and we'll look at some of the consequences of too much fat in the diet in terms of nutritional inadequacy as well as health effects. So there are 3 main approaches to feeding a fresh meat-based diet, and you can see them here. The first is to just feed natural foods in rotation and don't worry about balance. The second is the use of all-in-one nutrient blends. And the third is that targeted nutrient fortification that we mentioned. And we'll go through each one of those individually.
The feed natural foods and rotate, and I call it don't worry method. It's often called the prey model method, where it's 80% muscle meat, 10% bone, and 10% organs. As I said, when done right, this is absolutely the best way to feed foods when done right. And often some of the prey model feeders do not use any vegetables or fruits, so we're losing the polyphenols. And when done poorly, it differs from the ancestral diet even more than kibble does, depending on the ingredients and leanness of the ingredients used.
As we go through, you'll notice that we differentiate what we call true prey model, which mimics the ancestral diet, from prey model, as we've noted here in quotations, where the intent is probably where it needs to be, but the execution is falling far short of the ancestral diet. The next method is the all-in-one nutrient blend method, and this encompasses commercial foods that are using premixes, as well as the concept that home feeders might use of, well, just throw in a vitamin mineral supplement. And those approaches can lead to excesses and deficiencies in the diet. But it also encompasses well-formulated meal mixers, which can be used to great effect for home feeders to balance their diets at home.
Our approach is what we call targeted nutrient fortification. We use whole foods to meet all or most of National Research Council nutrient requirements, recommended amounts. And we look at the ancestral standards, the amount of protein and fat in the diet, the types of fat, and the minerals. When supplements are needed, we add them individually to meet the recommended amounts or recommended allowances. That's what RAs stand for specific life and a specific recipe. So if you look at some of our recipes, we may just have one supplement in there, for instance, a manganese amino acid chelate, because manganese is sometimes difficult to get into a prey model diet. Today, we're talking about macronutrients, though, but not the micronutrients.
Yes, and those are still important, but our focus today is more on the macronutrients. So there are a couple of ways that we can compare foods and assess them for nutritional adequacy. One is, as you see on the left side of the screen, there are 3 different organizations that have established nutrient profiles: NRC, which we've mentioned, and FEDIF and AFCO. FEDIF and AFCO being the European and American regulating bodies for pet food, respectively. And there are some differences there. Steve, I think you expressed these differences well.
There are major differences at times. The NRC, National Nutrient Requirements of Dogs and Cats, was published in 2006. It's really the scientific basis for most of what we're doing. FEDIF are the ones that I prefer to use because they're more exact. They deal with different life stages better, and they're updated yearly, or every other year, updated often. AVCO regulates pet foods in the United States. It has, as you'll see, fewer nutrient profiles, fewer activity levels. For dogs, I'd say the nutrient profiles are updated about once a decade, and for cats, perhaps once a century.
Poor cats, they just never get the attention. The other standard that we like to look at when we assess diets is the typical ancestral diet. And again, that's the model for, or that is the basis on which true prey model is founded. And so the typical ancestral diet includes 85% whole prey, so not just muscle meats, not just muscles and organs, but the whole prey, as well as all of the other things that the dog would find scavenging. So fish and eggs, but also fruits and veggies and nuts and seeds and dirt and poop and all of the things that dogs would eat in the wild as they're just looking for sources of calories. Their diet is actually quite diverse.
The analysis of the whole prey comes primarily from Dr. Ellen Dierenfeld's brilliant work, Nutrients in Whole Vertebrate Prey, excluding fish fed in zoos. She analyzed more than 1,000 prey animals. And so we have really good data. I think most people looking at the ancestral diet use primarily her data. So this gives you an idea of the nutrient profiles. On your left are the FEDF, that's the European profile. Note that they have an early growth and a late growth profile. And for their adults, as we move to the right, they have an active adult and a less active adult. So they're really doing a really good job there. They also have more safe upper limits and maximums than AVCO, which is in green, which has just one nutrient profile for growth and reproduction, and one for adult, which is highly active. And you'll see in a little bit why that does not always work. The next one in pink is our analysis of the ancestral diet. And then in the gray, we have NRC from 2006. So when we formulate, we're looking at all of these.
So there are three methods of formulating fresh meat-based diets and or formulating diets in general. And so we're going to look just briefly at the differences between them. The formulation can be on a caloric basis, a dry matter basis, or a metabolic basis. So the caloric basis is when we're looking at the amount of nutrient per 1,000 calories. And this is the most accurate way to formulate a meat-based diet for dogs and cats that follow the activity level assumptions of FEDF or AVCO, like we just showed you in that last slide. And we'll talk a little bit more about this. You can tell if a diet has been formulated on a caloric basis because the trace minerals will be listed as milligrams per 1,000 calories. Now, in contrast, dry matter formulation is used primarily for high carbohydrate processed diets because it's easier to calculate on a dry matter basis. And the clue there is that the trace minerals will be listed as milligrams per kilogram dry matter. And thirdly, the metabolic basis is the best way to formulate in order to meet the individual needs of a dog or a cat that does not fall into the activity level assumptions of the other nutrient profiles. And the clue there is that the trace minerals will be expressed as milligrams per day. So we're looking at what the dog or cat needs per day for each nutrient.
Fresh meat-based diets cannot be formulated on a dry matter basis. This is the slide Dr. Karen Becker and I have used for almost a decade now. On the left, we formulated a diet that meets all dry matter standards. As you can see, there's nothing in red. Everything is slightly higher than the 2014 AVCO all life stage minimums. And then I hit one button on the animal diet formulator and it converted it to a caloric basis. And you notice on the caloric basis, everything is deficient. We need, when we're formulating a diet with more than 4,000 calories per kilogram on a dry matter basis, National Research Council, FEDF, and AVCO all suggest or actually require you formulate it on a caloric basis, or if you formulate on a dry matter basis, you correct for energy density, which is not easy. It's easier just to do it right, formulate on a caloric basis.
So Steve, just to recap and make sure we're being clear, this is the same diet being shown in both of these charts here.
Same diet.
Same diet.
Absolute same diet, yeah.
Yeah. So,
one is deficient in everything, one meets all standards.
yes, and just a difference in the calculation. So metabolic basis formulating is, as we mentioned, it is a way of determining what an individual animal's nutrient need is for the day for each nutrient. And so again, this is the best method for formulating if a dog or a cat does not exactly match the activity level that is the assumption on which the FEDF or AVCO or NRC nutrient profiles are based.
I'm going to go through this Excel picture very quickly. We're going to introduce our metabolic formulating program probably at the Holistic Vet Conference next month. This is just a real quick teaser as to why it works. I'm sorry, I bounce around too much. I'm so excited about it.
My computer mouse is not happy about things, so it's randomly deciding what we're going to look at. Sorry about that.
Can you move this so I can see the right-hand corner?
try.
Good, thanks.
Yes.
FEDIAF, the Europeans, has 3 ways to do adult diets besides dry matter. On a caloric basis, you could formulate for less active dogs, for active dogs, or you could formulate on a metabolic basis. Here we're looking at FEDIAF's less active, which is based on this 15 kilogram dog, 33 pound, needing 720 calories a day. FEDIAF active is assuming a higher activity level, so the dog needs 833 calories a day. So when the dog gets the prescribed amount of calories based on activity level, you can notice in the calcium, daily calcium, 1.07 for both of them. The daily need showed in gold on the right-hand side says that on a metabolic basis, this 15 kilogram dog needs 1.07 grams of calcium a day. And the FEDIAF profiles are based on that. I also want you to notice that the active dog requirement is 1.25 grams per 1,000 calories, while the less active dog is 1.45 grams per 1,000 calories. What we're showing here is that for dogs eating fewer calories, for sedentary dogs, older dogs, they need more nutrients per calorie than do active and highly active dogs. And that's the basis of the metabolic program. So if we're feeding the proper amount of calories, we're going to meet the 1.07 guidelines. Let's look at what happens when this 15 kilogram dog is only eating 650 calories, which is what I call American couch potato calories for this 15 kilogram dog. Notice its daily calcium, even on formulated on FEDIAF less active, is 0.94 grams, less than the 1.07, which is a recommended minimum. And if you formulate on FEDIAF active, it's 0.81. And if you formulate on AVCO, you'll get about half of the daily need, because AVCO's formulated its basis, it assumes the dogs are highly active, not American couch potatoes. And if we do NRC, this is the same situation with NRC. NRC has a lower amount that they're recommending on a metabolic basis for the dog, 0.13. So this 15 kg dog needs only 1 gram, according to them. But when you formulate on a caloric basis, theirs is for a very highly active dog, you're getting not even 2/3 of the recommended minimum for calcium. So for sedentary dogs, and we're going to describe this in much more detail later on, for sedentary dogs, it's advised to formulate on a metabolic basis.
So that was kind of a recap of, in general, how fresh meat-based diets can be fed, how they can be formulated, and how we can compare them. And now we're going to look at some of the consequences, or what we're calling the macro dangers, of using the prey model approach when using grocery store ingredients. So not true prey model, but prey model.
And when they're following influencers who prefer ignorance to knowledge. And if you sense some anger, I am angry. When I helped found this industry back in 1997, we all had differences of opinions, but everybody was striving to learn and apply their knowledge to help everybody. Now I'm finding influencers have a ignorance is a badge of honor situation, and the most ignorant people get the most followings at time.
And speaking as a veterinarian, I know that I cannot recommend a recipe or a diet to my clients to feed to their dogs if I don't know that it is nutritionally complete and balanced, because I know that eventually we could see some health ramifications from that nutritional inadequacy. So knowing what's in the diet and making sure that it is meeting the needs, we know what it takes to feed dogs with the minimum requirements to sustain life. So if we're not at least meeting those minimums, we know that there are going to be ramifications.
So, but today, my anger comes because we've been talking about micronutrients deficiency in the prey model diets for years, and that's a problem. But now I'm finding that it's a macronutrient problem. The amount of protein, quite often, that people who without knowledge are recommending meats to use won't sustain life for a puppy. And the amount of fat can cause lots of pro-inflammatory problems. So the true prey model done right, in my opinion, can be great. It includes all the organs. I think I bounce around too much.
Well, no,
I'm just so excited because I'm really, as I said, I have a lot of emotion. I'm angry. So, and then lean body parts from well-raised or wild animals, and fiber or non-digestible parts. It's the best way if you could get the right ingredients.
Fiber from non-digestible parts, but also, Steve,
From plants.
from
Yes.
plants.
Yeah,
Yes.
we need the polyphenols.
Yes.
And every dog I've ever known is eating grass. So if you're feeding a prey model diet and don't have any vegetables or fruits in there, chances are your dog's gonna eat grass.
And again, this
Good
is
grass we want, not pesticide treated grass.
yes, exactly. And again, this is based on the ancestral diet and looking at what was in the gut contents,
Yeah.
what those animals were eating. They were eating plants also.
Some of the guidelines by so-called gurus are ignorant and dangerous, and we're going to go over one of them right now. A friend sent me a website from a woman who produces the absolute best diet possible for her own dogs. She hunts, she gets all this wild prey. She has a farm with pasture-raised animals, and she feeds the entire animals. She does a superb job with her dogs. And then she thought she could teach people how to do that, people in the city or suburbs that can't get the wild prey, that aren't surrounded by hunters. And one thing she said is just go to the grocery store and buy the cheapest ground meat you can find. The worst advice I've ever heard for feeding dogs. So here I'm looking at the Ancestral Diet, based mostly on Dierdenfeld's work, 90% lean beef and 60% lean beef, which is the cheapest ground meat I was able to find. Notice that the Ancestral Diet, 44% of the calories from protein, 49% from fat. It varies throughout the year, and it varies throughout different geographic locations.
There we go.
There we go. And generally speaking, the Ancestral Diet, because there are no fat animals in the wild, they're lean animals. Fat animals will never survive, maybe in the fall right before hibernation, but rarely. So the calories of 1 pound of ancestral or 90% lean are about 750 to 800, plus or minus, obviously. And you can see the zinc is about the same. But when we look at 60% lean beef, the cheapest ground meat we could find, 9% of the calories are from protein. 91% of the calories are from fat. 1,800 calories in 1 pound, which really messed up when she was saying you feed 2 to 3% of the body weight per day. We'll show you that in a minute. And then the zinc is less than half of what we would get in the Ancestral Diet per pound of meat. So if any recipe does not list the leanness of the meat to use if you're using beef, don't use the recipe. Next slide. There's also, I'm sorry, I'm just so excited about that. There's also, as we've talked about, micronutrient issues when you're buying cheap meat. Here we're seeing that the micronutrient content of 60% lean compared to 90% lean is about 1/5, maybe 1/10 at time. It's a world of difference. Next slide. And this is yours.
Okay. So one of the consequences of that dangerous guideline to just feed the cheapest meat you can find is that high fat beef diets, when they're higher in fat, they're lower in protein, as Steve just showed us. And one of the amino acids, one of the components of protein that can be deficient is tryptophan. So tryptophan is an amino acid that is a precursor of serotonin. Serotonin, of course, very important in neurotransmitting in the brain and the nervous system. So if we're looking at a 70% lean ground beef diet, there's only 0.22 grams per 1,000 kilocalories of tryptophan. AFCO's minimum amount for puppies for the growth stage is 0.5 grams per 1,000 kilocalories, and FEDIEF's is 0.58 grams per 1,000 kilocalories. So we're very deficient there in the amount of tryptophan. The consequence of that is if that puppy's brain is not working well because it doesn't have enough tryptophan to make serotonin, we can see behavioral issues. So when you hear people say things like, don't feed raw diets because it makes dogs aggressive, there could actually be a tiny bit of truth in that if you're feeding a poor quality raw diet that is not true prey model when you're using high fat meats and causing protein deficiency.
This one really gets me upset. I have bred dogs in the past, and you just don't mess with growth recipes. So if you're using 70% lean in an 80-10-10 diet, there is not, most likely, unless you're using, I'm not seeing it, there's not enough protein to feed puppies. It doesn't meet AFCO standards, it doesn't meet NRC standards or FEDEF standards. And the amount of fat in that 70% lean 80-10-10 diet exceeds all safe upper limits. But it's the protein, not enough protein for puppies, that really bothers me. So if you're raising puppies, this is the time to do it absolutely right. If you can't do prey model right, then buy a commercial recipe, or the best way, learn how to do prey model right. The second problem we have, we talked about beef, okay? So beef, high-fat beef has major problems. High-fat chicken has significant problems as well, and it's primarily excess omega-6 fatty acids. All the science, human, mouse, feline, canine science agree too much linoleic acid, LA, and omega-6 is not healthy, and they all have maximum standards. Do you want to say why it's not healthy?
Yeah, we know that omega-6 fatty acids are essential. Like LA is an essential nutrient. We have to provide some. It is part of the necessary building blocks for an inflammatory response, a normal inflammatory response, and for our patients, our pets, to be able to function normally, they need it. However, when there's too much omega-6 fatty acid, that skews the inflammatory response and it becomes pro-inflammatory. So by feeding excess amounts of these omega-6 fatty acids, primarily linoleic acid, we can actually cause inflammation in our dogs' bodies.
And so do you think those standards of maximum standards we're showing there will come down in the future?
Wow, Steve, I don't know. I think that's a question that you might be able to answer
I'm
better than
expecting
me.
FEDEF updates every other year. I expect theirs to maybe be reduced.
Yes.
AVCO next decade, and NRC their next update. But I keep reading from human nutrition scientists the dangers with excess LA. Let's go to look at what the next slide. So I've read recipes from so-called influencers that just say we use 1 pound of chicken. Raw chicken. Let's look at that. On your right, we're having fat per pound, grams of fat per pound, and 2 different types of chicken, and then LA per pound. They're identical, except this chicken thigh meat without the skin and without the separable fat. This is USDA data directly from their website. And below it is the same piece of meat with the meat and with the skin and with the separable fat. Notice that the chicken thigh with meat and skin and fat has more than 5 times the amount of LA per pound than chicken thigh meat without the skin and fat. And same with the amount of total fat. So when you see a recipe and the recipe says 1 pound chicken meat, and it doesn't say with or without skin, you know the influencer doesn't know what she or he is doing, and you know you should avoid that recipe. This is just an idea of what we want you to learn. If you want to make great prey model diets, you need to learn some basics. And this looks at the difference in the types of fat in chicken light meat with no skin, chicken dark meat with no skin, and beef ground. And these are all percentages of the fat. So going down to LA, chicken light meat without the skin has 14% of the fat is LA, and it's a low fat product, chicken light meat. without the skin. Chicken dark meat without the skin has considerably more LA than does chicken light meat. So if you are concerned about too much LA for your dog, you may want to switch to the more expensive product, chicken light meat. On the other hand, beef does not have enough LA to meet minimums. I don't care if you use 60% beef or 97% lean beef, it will not have enough LA to meet minimums because it is naturally very, very low in LA. That's one good reason to rotate.
So this graphic is demonstrating the difference between what we're calling true prey model and what many prey model feeders feed, which is not actually prey model. So the top two rows of this chart are showing true prey, wild animals. Wild animals are much leaner than typical grocery store meats that we can buy. And that's illustrated here. You can see the differences in the fat percentages between the wild duck and other game birds versus chicken backs or domesticated duck, which both have far more fat. And the LA differences are also quite striking as well. So total fat as well as individual fats.
And I've seen a lot of recipes says just put in chicken backs for the calcium. The chicken back at the Animal Diet Formulator, we've looked at 8 different tests. They all vary, so there's no definitive amount. But the chicken backs provide so much fat and so much LA that it's very difficult to make a good recipe using chicken backs. Chicken necks are much better because we can remove some of the skin and fat, as you'll see. We've shown this slide quite a bit for years. It's mostly talking about the considerable micronutrient difference between wild duck and domesticated duck, all USDA data.
Yeah, so again, we're focusing mostly on macronutrients today, but let's not forget that micronutrients matter, and the difference between true prey model and what some people call prey model extends to not just the macronutrients, but also the micronutrients, all the vitamins and minerals that are essential for dogs.
So do you want to take it?
Sure.
Okay.
So we've mentioned that rotation is an important component of feeding true prey model. And that is because of things like the difference in the types of fats that Steve just explained with the LA and other types of fats that vary in percentage based on the type of meat that you're feeding. So if we rotate true prey model meats, then we can get kind of an ideal amount of linoleic acid. So the top row in that chart is showing rotation of lean meats, and we're getting an almost ideal LA amount for this dog with that rotation. The bottom row is showing rotating typical grocery store meats, which are not prey model like at all. They are far too fatty, and although that helps to lower the LA amount, it's still too high, and the overall total fat is much, much too high.
So really what we want you to learn, for influencers especially, for pet parents making your own foods, we want you to learn about fats, because more than any other nutrient, the dog is the fat she eats. And learning about fats may sound difficult. It's not. If you're motivated and you spend just maybe an hour or two learning about fats, we will have a full program on how to do this in the future. We'll have some seminars, but if you do this, then you're much more likely to produce a much better prey model type diet. What we're concerned about with fats is total fat, because many prey model diets have too much fat. Of course, a lot of kibbles don't have enough, in our opinion. We're concerned about LA minimums and maximums. Just, do we have time for a quick history of LA?
A real quick
history. Back in the 1970s, 2 foods introduced, packaging improved, so they were able to add LA to their food because the packaging was improved and the grease wouldn't show through the package. And these 2 foods, Eukanuba and Science Diet, took over the market because they are the first foods that really had sufficient LA, and the dog's coats and skins blossomed. So now we remember that LA was the first fatty acid National Research Council considered to be essential in 1985. But now we're learning about maximums. The second thing I want you to learn about, well, third is total fat, LA and EPA and DHA. Those are the fats we get from fish, and they're very highly fragile, but we need some. The Avco and FedEF do not require it for adult dogs. NRC does. And the reason it's not required for adult dogs, in my opinion, is it's so fragile. When you open a bag of dog food, remember, most things are aimed at bags of dog food. When you open a bag of dog food and there's EPA and DHA in it, they will start turning rancid. So learn how to handle EPA and DHA, and it's best to add it right before serving. And the last thing we need to learn about is omega-6, omega-3 ratios can be extremely deceiving. I've seen omega-6 or omega-3 ratios of 2 to 1. They say it's perfect and has too much LA. And I've seen the same thing saying it has no EPA and DHA. So don't look at omega-6 to omega-3 ratios as being the gold standard. It is the gold standard if the LA amounts are right and the EPA and DHA amounts are right. It's not difficult to learn this.
So,
all right, this is one of my favorite ones. Yeah. Okay. I interact with a lot of professionals from the commercial companies, the dry food companies, and invariably they don't respect our industry, the fresh meat-based diet industry. They laugh at this industry because we don't know the basics of nutrition 101 is what they say. They say, and they're right, many of the fresh meat-based diet people who are formulating don't know about the energy requirements of dogs. It's standard science. It's used by all professional companies and all scientists. The amount of calories the dog needs is a K factor depending on activity level times the weight of the dog in kilograms to 3/4 power. That's called Kleiber's law. It's from, I think, the late 1800s or something. I don't remember exactly, but it's firm. It's in science.
So in contrast to that, I think we didn't mention that it's on the slide here, but many people following the prey model approach will say feed 2 to 3% of the dog's weight in pounds rather than following Kleiber's law. And we can see from this chart here why that doesn't work. So Steve just described Kleiber's law, and the dog's calorie need is dependent on their body weight in kilograms to the 3/4 power times that activity level factor. And you can see here that we have different dog body weights listed on the left side, and in the middle is showing how many calories they need per day for less active activity level. And look at how many kilocalories per kilogram of body weight that ends up being. So this tiny dog, this 3-pound dog, needs many, 3 kilogram dog needs many more calories per kilogram than does this 50 kilogram dog. So the weight is not, the energy requirement is not linear. You can't just say feed 2 to 3% of the body weight in pounds and end up with the correct amount of calories that that dog needs for an energy level.
So we're combining the two things. We're combining the advice, just feed the cheapest meat you can get and feed 2 to 3% of the dog's body weight per day in pounds. So now we're back in pounds, and what we're seeing is this advice, if you're feeding 60% lean for a large dog, can result in like 3 times more calories than the dog needs, and there's no mystery why so many American dogs are fat. On the other hand, if you're feeding 90% lean, the right-hand column, you're going to be really close to the right amount of calories, maybe a little higher at the 100-pound level.
Yeah, but too low on the low weight end.
Yeah, those small dogs, it's really based upon the calculations are based upon the ratio between volume of the dog and surface area, which gives a very good indication of the heat loss of the dog. The larger the volume, to surface area ratio. That's a big dog, the fewer calories the dog needs. My little dog has a very small volume to surface area ratio. So if I put him out in the Minneapolis winter, he's going to need, 10 times more calories per pound of body weight than a bigger dog.
Yeah. So this chart shows nicely that even though we're telling you that lean meats are what fits the true prey model, you still can't use that guideline, even if you're using the appropriate lean meats. So the Kleiber's law is how we determine calorie need.
This is an important one, a very important one. And this is the only micronutrient slide we're going to talk about. And it's liver in commercial, it's copper in commercial beef liver. Dr. Barbara Royal, who you just met, has been working with Dr. Ellen Deerdenfeld, who we talked about, and Dr. Lori Koger to try to determine how much copper is in commercial fed beef liver and in true grass-fed beef liver, and how much copper is too much for the dog, because there's an increase, I think, as everybody knows, in copper storage disease and other problems. So we're trying to come up with guidelines on this is commercial liver. So if you're using 4% liver and you're using 80% lean beef as your 80-10-10 ingredient, you get 2.2 milligrams of copper. If you're using 90% lean, it's more mineral rich, it's 3.8 milligrams of copper. The recommended allowance for the 15 kilogram, 33 pound dog is 1.5 milligrams a day. That's the minimum. So 4% liver, we exceed that. Now, our maximum allowance of copper is 5.9 milligrams per day. And when I said our, it's based on the European version, FEDEF maximums for copper on a dry matter basis that we converted to a metabolic basis. And notice that 10% liver, it's too much for this 15 kilogram dog. And then there are still people out there, I think, recommending just give your dog a liver for the day. And in that case, the dog's going to get almost 90 milligrams of copper, 15 kg dog, which is 15 times higher than our maximums.
Yeah.
I just can't see that being healthy.
And to be clear, we're not vilifying liver. We love liver as an organ meat to use as part of a complete and balanced diet, but we're saying you have to pay attention to how much liver you're feeding. You have to know what's in the diet in order to make sure that your dog is getting adequate copper, but not too much copper. So when we hear people say things like just feed an entire bowl of liver for one meal, it makes us really worried. And again, as a veterinarian, I could not recommend that to my clients for them to do to their dogs, because I know that there could be serious health ramifications from that massive overload of copper that dogs get.
Now, I just want to be clear, if this is a bison liver, the bison liver may have 1/2 to 1/4 the amount of copper as beef liver. If it's true free range, never get a salt lick, no mineral adjustments whatsoever, the amount of copper in the beef liver could be 1/4 of this, but we never know. Dr. Royal has tested a lot of grass-fed beef livers and found some of the grass-fed beef livers have just as much copper as the commercially fed beef liver. So if you don't know, err on the side of caution. Keep it to 4% liver unless you know how much copper is in that liver, and that's very difficult to find out.
And even if the liver had 1/4 of the copper, an entire meal of liver is still going to be far too much copper.
Certainly not ancestral or pregnant.
Yeah.
So these are just some of the big time dangers of not knowing what you're doing. You need to know what you're doing. Otherwise, you have too many calories and not enough nutrients, including too much LA, not enough of LA in expensive high-fat beef meats.
However, too much LA in poultry.
Too much LA in domesticated poultry. Now, if you're feeding wild prey, you're not going to have too much LA. But if you're feeding domesticated poultry, even if they're called free range, the chances are that you will exceed maximums for LA. And I think from the science I'm seeing in human nutrition, I think the canine and feline maximums are too high and need to be lower.
And just as an aside, Steve, there are some websites that are selling purported prey model meats, wild meats that are not true prey model meats. Their fatty acid profile and their fat profile is much too high.
Yeah, they may be selling parts that they say are prey model, but if they're domesticated, even free range, the chances are they're going to have too much LA.
Yes.
And then, of course, there's too much copper in beef recipes.
Yes.
I think that's it.
Oh, nope, we got a few.
This is our summary.
Mhm.
And I'm going to say this because I use the word dangers. And I do that with emotion because there are big time dangers if you don't bother to learn what you need to learn. And it's easy. Learn what you need to learn. If a recipe says 1 pound beef without specifying the content, fat content, don't use the recipe. Assume the influencer, whoever wrote that recipe, didn't know what's in it. If the recipe says 1 pound chicken without specifying with skin or no skin, again, it wasn't analyzed. The influencer didn't know what's in it. Don't use the recipe. You may have too much LA. And if a recipe does not specify the maximum amount of commercially raised beef livers you should use in an 80-10-10 diet, and they're saying you can use as much as you want, don't use the recipe.
Yes. And so just in summary, we want to make sure that you come away knowing that we think true prey model is a great way to feed your dog. It uses prey model ingredients and it mimics the ancestral diet, which we know helps dogs thrive. We know how to ensure that there are no deficiencies or excesses in our dogs' diets. We know what that science says, that here are the minimum amounts of nutrients needed to sustain life. So why in the world wouldn't we do that and provide our dogs everything they need to remain alive? But we'd like to even go beyond that. Once we know how to formulate properly, we can make sure they're not just alive, but they're thriving. So there's really no reason to take risks. We want to teach you how to formulate recipes and how to look at recipes that have been formulated well versus those that have not been formulated at all. They're just a listing of ingredients with no knowledge of what's in that recipe and what's in your dog's food bowl. So what's our final takeaway, Steve?
Learn. Please, if you're feeding true prey, if you want to feed true prey model diets, spend some time learning. You don't have to be a spreadsheet guru like me, but you need to learn. Start with the macronutrients, and then when you get the macronutrients right, the protein, fat right, then you could look at the micronutrients of concern: manganese, iodine, vitamin D, and vitamin E. And if you look at macro and then those 4 micronutrients, you're going to have probably a very good diet.
Great. Yeah.
Good. Well, thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.